Okay, so we've talked about building on abilities, the initiative of the Community Living and Disability Services for a while now, and got some questions after break. And so what I want to do is at least deal with 3 of the questions before we leave today. Just to say, we are going to be doing 2 more videos. One will be on the implications of new service models and options, and the last one will be on what families can do to safeguard that their son or daughter, cousin, brother, sister is receiving quality supports. So we'll start with the questions. So one of the questions was, is BOA a service reform? Service reform is typically when the system is aligned with best practice outcomes, when we're trying to change the system to improve it. And in 2017, 2018, that would mean we're looking at things like human rights, we're paying attention to social inclusion, the presence and participation of people in society, we're paying attention to social capital, relationships and belonging for people, we're paying attention to self-determination, choice and control that people have in their life. And we're looking at the wisdom and the learning of, say, in this case, the last 20 years, because the system in Manitoba has not really been addressed at this scale in that time. So we've been looking at what's the wisdom and learning that's happened both provincially, nationally, and internationally in the support of people with disabilities. So there's 4 or 5 things that mark system reform. The first of those is it has democratic leadership. That typically in a system reform, you have an open leadership, and in this case it would include families, self-advocates, government advocates, service providers, and it would be headed, usually the way they function is with a task force or a steering committee. And the steering committee usually seeks out a person with knowledge of the field, and they're the person who's going to guide this through the process. But it's a democratic process. There's a lot of people involved in it, all the people that have to be involved, and it functions as a task force and a steering committee. And it starts with conceptualization. So it doesn't start with implementation or later. It starts with at the very thinking about the concept of reform, what kind of reform people want. The second one is stakeholders. And the stakeholders, as I said, you have to identify who are the people that this reform is going to impact. Who are the people that should be involved in talking about this? And there's basically 5 groups that I would identify. First and foremost would be families, because they're the people, and individuals, families, individuals, because they're the people who are impacted the most. The second is government. Obviously, they're key to the process. Then service providers. These are the people who live every day with providing supports, and they should be involved. This is the work. They should be involved in the process of thinking about what constitutes quality support. And then there should be advocates, people who have strong positions on the things I talked about: human rights, social inclusion, social capital, self-determination. People who have strongly want to promote these things to ensure that they're part of the reform. So that's the second thing. The third is engagement of the issue of sustainability. Sustainability in a system reform it asks 2 questions. The first question it asks is, what do we want to sustain? And that's a quality question. What are the things that we want after we finish the reform? What are the things that we want to see in the lives of people? For families and for individuals with developmental disabilities, what do we want to see? So what do we want to do is a key question. And it's actually a guiding question. But what do we want to have? And that has to be really clear to drive the reform process. The second question that system reform asks is, how can we sustain this? How do we pay for this? So it isn't like the question of funding and budget and things like that are not part of system reform. Of course, it's part of system reform, but they're not the first question. The first question is, what do you want to do? What do we want to sustain? What's worth sustaining? The fourth aspect in system reform is planning. So once you've got through the steps of the reform, and you've established your goals and you're looking at things, then you have to get to a plan. And the plan should have really clearly stated goals, and we call them desired outcomes that will be able to look to measure the reform. What is it that this reform is going to do? That should be the plan, and it should be at the very start, and it should be explicit, and it should be transparent, and people should know about it and know the roles that people are going to play in it. So system reform is an open process. The fancy word that I like to use to pretend that I'm smart is that it's dialogical. And that means that system reform usually is many stories. It represents several stories. Several stories are involved are represented in the figuring out and the conceptualization of the idea of the reform. Then that would be the people I talked about. So there's several stories, and it listens. System reform listens to people. It pays attention to people's opinions, and it acts on shared knowledge. And so the stakeholders that I described to you that's a powerful group of shared knowledge when you have all those people together thinking about how the world could be better for folks with disabilities. Our position, the position that we have at Community Living Manitoba after reviewing Building on Abilities, is this is the case. The case is that it is not system reform. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we think it is. So our understanding is that the BOA, Building on Abilities, is system adjustment. And system adjustment is different from system reform. System adjustment, rather than aligning itself with best practice, and I'd lump those into the term quality, it aligns itself with typically external directives. And right now, with several governments across North America, this is usually associated with what's called austerity budgeting and austerity planning. And that typically means that the goal, rather than the goals in system reform that I outlined, are focused more on cost containment and cost cutting. And the goals in system reform are around individuals. They're goals for people. We want those things for people. We want to have their rights respected. We want them to participate in society. We want them to have embedded, deep relationships. We want them to have choices. We want them to have control. We want them to have social power. That's what we want for people. Typically, the goals in system adjustment are not goals for individuals, they're goals for the system. And in Building on Abilities, the goals that at least we can ascertain from what we've read and the things that we've attended and listened are, they want it to be fair, they want it to be equitable, they want it to be transparent, and they want it to be predictable. Now, even though we're having problems when we look at this at understanding what does fair mean, what does equitable mean in terms of what when that comes out to an outcome for an individual, what does that mean? That it's transparent. We're having trouble with these as goals, as understanding them, because really they relate to the system's needs. They don't relate to the individuals and families' needs. So these are things. And the system may well believe, and the system probably does, need some sort of predictability in it. And so that's fine. However, it does not address the issues of quality that we think are important, and it does not address individuals. So that's a major thing to pay attention to, is that the overall goal is not to reform the system. It's to have a system that works for the people who work in the system. The structural and the format in in system adjustment is different. So I'll try to use the same 4 or 5 indicators that I used in reform. So first we'll look at leadership. And leadership is not democratic in system adjustment. Leadership is fixed within government. So government is the leadership. That is clearly stated. Stakeholder participation. The stakeholder participation is very controlled and contained. And in reading the information over the last year from the people who promote the type of system that BOA is using, they actually recommend that you don't even roll out the system that you're going to use until it's ready to go. That people don't really get to talk about it. And when you get to talk about it, that there's a very controlled information process. That is, you attend presentations where you're told what exists, and that is it. Participation of stakeholders, agencies, advocates is clearly controlled and defined as very advisory capacity, minimal advisory capacity from our perspective. So there's very controlled stakeholder participation, and that we think that's built right into the model. That's there. So you don't have representation of family and individuals and agencies. You have the government's perspective. When you get it, it's complete. When BOA arrived, it had been cooking for years in the basement of the legislature, I imagine, or somewhere, and when it arrived, it was complete. And then what we came to call the PowerPoint karaoke started, where you could attend sessions where there would be an hour of PowerPoint that would basically just tell you this is the world, this is reality. And it really didn't leave time. It was hard for everyone to have, I think, educated comments because of the weight of the presentations and the weight of information that you were trying to absorb. The third thing is sustainability. There's a single question that guides BOA, and I don't think it's a quality question, or we don't think it's a quality question. We think it's the cost containment question. We think that is the overriding question. That's the question about this. That's a systems question. The question of what is worth doing is not a question that appears clearly. In most of the information I've reviewed, preliminary information on BOA and the people who promote this model of with the support intensity scale, there's not much talk about quality at all. I don't think I've come across any place where it talks about human rights. The things we talked about with with social inclusion, self-determination, those things don't appear. They appear to be plans for how do you manage this? How do you manage your service system? That's the selling point for it. And one of the things that BOA says quite often in their presentations is that this model is being used many places across North America and Canada. And that's true, it is being used some places across Canada and the United States. What they don't say is that overwhelmingly it's not being used in other places, which is interesting. So nor do they talk about the downside. There's rarely any mention of a downside. And that's a concern because when you think about even when you take medication, there's side effects that are listed. There's always side effects, and in social innovation, there's always unpredictable outcomes that occur. But this is sort of presented in a way that it can't fail, and that's concerning. So they have this single question that guides it. I don't know, I guess the last thing I'd say is that about this is that where system reform is dialogical, system adjustment is monological. And that means it's a single story. It isn't a story. It isn't a story of many voices or shared voices. It's a system of one voice. Okay, system adjustment is one voice. And that's very clear. There is one voice. This is really problematic because what it can tend to do is it can tend to put people who are doing what I'm doing today into the box of being viewed as oppositional or fear-mongering. Because you sort of get off to a point where you're only left so many positions. And if you do make comments that are contrary to BOA, then you're seen as oppositional. You don't really understand it, and at the worst is fear-mongering. You're trying to generate fear against it. Had BOA taken a system reform approach, and everyone had been working on this would not be the case. People would understand. Those fights would have happened. Those arguments, those things would have happened in that process. And that's normative. And that's not a bad thing. Now we're left with this single story that's very, very difficult to critique. So that's it for that. Any other questions about that? I'll be glad to talk to people about this more at the end. There's one more issue that I wanted to talk about today that will set up the next two videos, and that's the implication of system adjustment for individuals and families. So, I kind of critique, there's a difference, I've said there's a difference between reform and adjustment, and now I want to talk more about what the implications are for families. So, the failure of system adjustment to focus on quality, what that does is it increases the vulnerability of people in the system. Because if your single goal, or if the overriding goal is cost containment, then some things are going to fall into place which really jeopardize quality. So one of the first things that jeopardizes is that things get cut, things get left out. So for example, what families and individuals expect from service is competence. That is, if I'm a parent and my son or daughter is living in some community living setting, I want to know that the people that are supporting them are competent. That means they're educated, that means they're trained. I want to know that. And there doesn't seem to be any provision for training in BOA as we see it as a budget line. We don't see anything like an initiative to work on training for excellence that would support the people that deliver services. So they're just not going to be the quality that you want to have if people aren't trained. And they have to be trained around both in terms of their values and in their competencies and support, personal care, all those things. And plus you want people to be trained. When I say trained in values, individuals with developmental disabilities, they spend the greatest majority of their time in their life with support workers once they're adults. Those are the people that they see the most. So in terms of values, you want people to be good companions. That's at least a minimal expectation that if someone is supporting someone, that they'll be a good companion. That is, that they'll regard the person and relate to the person in positive ways. That the person won't spend their day with someone who doesn't really care to be with them. And if we think about that, we'll understand how debilitating that would be. So people have to be trained both in terms of values and in competencies. Competencies like how do you help people increase their participation in society? How do you help people to increase their decision making? All those kind of things. But people need to be trained to do that. The second thing that's a concern is that there's not a push, and this would be a push, I believe, in any kind of system reform, that the salaries, the starting salaries are $13 and something, and the projected maximum is $15. And this creates a very unstable workforce. People come and go very fast. Agencies have a difficult time maintaining or retaining staff. And this should be addressed. There should be at least a long-range plan to get salaries to the level that people, that it's a living wage, and that people can be attracted to work in it, who want to work with people with disabilities. So that's a big thing about quality. So those two things, if you have a low-paid workforce that isn't well-trained, that compromises quality, and it exposes people to vulnerability. A fear we have is that, in terms of cost reduction, that there may be an inclination to modify models of service. So for a long time, we've learned that one of the most important things, I think, in the last 20 years is that treating people as individuals and individualization is key to people transforming their lives, to be regarded and related to as an individual. And so over that time, we've tried to figure out different ways for people to live as individuals. And so there's a fear that in terms of cost containment, that people will be added to whatever settings exist in terms of economy of scale to lower the cost. And the sacrifice there will be individuality and individualization. And so we're worried about that. And I will talk in the next video a lot about that. Then a question came up at the town hall, which was about utilizing for-profit providers. And the government was, at the town hall, was very unclear on what the status of nonprofit providers are in the province. So philosophically, we have a couple of issues as an organization, as Community Living Manitoba, with for-profit service providers. The first is that as a business, your goal, and I'm fine with this, if Payless Shoes wants to do this, I don't have a problem with it. But the idea in business is to maximize your profit and to minimize your cost. We think that's a lousy model to support human beings. And so we're nervous just about the idea of this becoming a business, of this becoming an industry. And the second part of that is that we think that when it does become a business, it turns people, it moves people from being persons to commodities. And people are viewed as commodities when that happens. You need so many of them. They cost so much. So the thinking, we have concerns about the thinking. We're not saying that every for-profit organization does this. We're just saying philosophically and in general, we don't think that it's wise to move from a nonprofit agency base to move to a for-profit. And at least we'd like to know what the plans, because one of the things that BOA says it is transparent. We'd like to know exactly what is going on with that. So that basically covers the first part of some of the difference between system reform and system adjustment. One last thing, because it was another question, and the person wanted me to speak to that, was the KPMG report. So there was this massive report done that the government of Manitoba contracted for with the consulting company KPMG. and it's a 120-some page document. Disability makes up only, if you read it, it makes up there's one paragraph, and then within that paragraph, there's really only 2 sentences. And in those 2 sentences, they talk about, the first thing is they think that they suggest the government look at means testing. They don't say anything more about that. Don't know what that means, although clearly it's related to cost. And the second thing they suggest is more concerning, and that they suggest that the government review their goals that exist in many of the written materials of the government and things that they have supported, of supporting people to be participating in the community, to become participating and to be present in the community. So that's very concerning, that that would be seen as an area of savings, would be to limit people's participation or to not financially support of people. More concerning is what's not in the report or in the paragraph. There's nothing in the KPGM report about human rights, about citizenship, about the status of people in Canada who have developmental disabilities. And so I think what we need is clarity if there is a relationship between the KPGM report and BOA. And that's as much as I know about it. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we will be doing the other 2 videos. So thank you very much.